Passing your school facilities bond. What to know, campaign strategies, legalese, do's and don'ts, millions of dollars at stake. Let's go.
Ready or not, here they come. Be sure to visit schoolstatus.com, peachjar.com, nickelstrategies.com, and s'more.com. Advocating for public education, sharing our stories and celebrating our schools, students, and staff. From crisis communications to media relations, social media, and everything in between, we're here to give you the best strategies, tools, and techniques to help you help your community. Welcome to the School PR Podcast, brought to you by Peach Jar, School Status, Nickel Strategies, and s'more. Love 'em or leave 'em. Here's your hosts, Matthew Jennings and Ryan Ferran.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Happy you are with us. New school year, new sponsors. Big thanks to s'more and School Status for jumping on the School PR Podcast train. We really appreciate their support and partnering with them. We'll chat with them on future episodes, so really looking forward to that. You know what s'more is, great newsletters. Check them out, s'more.com. School Status, you can find them at schoolstatus.com. They do a lot of cool stuff for engagement and a lot with attendance and campaigns and stuff like that. So check out schoolstatus.com. Thrilled to have them aboard, along with Peach Jar and Nickel Strategies as always. Today, we are talking facilities bonds. There are so many school districts getting ready for the November ballot. In California alone, rough estimates, according to some people in the know, over 200 school districts up and down the Golden State going for a facilities bond. Millions and millions of dollars at stake. This is how you fund public schools, upgrading facilities in California. It's the only way to do it. And this is it. So really important information. This actually, what we're about to talk about and discuss, is a conversation that myself, Matthew, and Jake Finch had for the Peach Jar Extra Credit a little while ago. And it just came out. So I thought we'd throw it on the podcast because it's a really good conversation. Jake really knows facilities bonds and campaigning and strategies, and I've been involved with them before, going through it right now. So really important information, and this can be a huge game changer for your school district, passing or not passing these. So I know a lot of people are interested in this, whether you're in school communications or not. You may be listening and you're a part of a team and you don't really listen to our podcast, but this is important information because there's so much on the line. So we welcome you to the School PR Podcast, where we normally talk mostly about communications, media relations, crisis communications. So great you're aboard. Please check us out on social media, School PR Podcast. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, all that sort of stuff, where we post clips and other information and resources. So follow us there. And enjoy this conversation, and we will chat soon.
Hey there, thank you so much, Jake. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining me here today on this topic. I know that you're particularly passionate about it. I know you've done a lot of really great work in this area. I know I've been through at least one successful bond campaign that I can remember. And it's just going to be really great to talk about this today. So before we get into that, if you wouldn't mind, let's just take a little moment and let everybody get to know you just a little bit. So Jake, if you don't mind, who are you and how did you get here?
I am the Public Information Officer and Public Relations Coordinator for Simi Valley Unified School District. I've been there for 10 years next week. Before that, I was a print journalist, so I come to it from the other side of the coin, but
Yes.
it works.
Good side of the coin.
It works.
There we go.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how big is your district?
We have 28 schools. We're K-12 or TK-12 now, and we have about 16,000 students.
That's a lot. It's a big district. Okay. And Ryan, a little bit about you.
Ryan Ferran, Chief Communication Officer in Arcadia Unified. Like Jake, I've been at my district for about 10 years now. Mm-hmm. Time flies. Former journalist as well, and co-host of the School PR Podcast with familiar face here.
Yeah, so if you're not following the School PR podcast, be sure to tune in on that one. This will also be one of the podcast episodes as well. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, thank you for your support. And if you're watching on YouTube, please extra credit. We appreciate that as well. I should say we are here at the Conference Hotel, the CalSPRA annual conference. We're here at the state capitol in Sacramento. There's a lot of activity. You might hear a lot of talking, a lot of noise. It's really, really fun. So just bear with us, but stay with us because you're going to hear what these two have to impart. So let's just jump into it a little bit. I know in Oceanside, I got to be part of a $163 million bond campaign. We were the only bond passed in San Diego that season. I think all the other districts had gone out for a bond as well, and it can be really tricky.
It's tough, and it's a great topic that you're having us talk about because whether people know it or not, they'll probably, with our financial forecast in California at least, a lot of people will probably be going out for them the next few years because money is tight. And the tricky part is part of the funding formula in California is it's a necessity to go to your community and ask for funding because there's not enough coming from the state. And you hear the numbers about how many pass, how many don't pass, but it's kind of a unfortunate, sad reality that we all have to do that, at least here in California. So it's an important topic, and passing that bond is a huge difference, makes a huge difference in students' education. So great topic.
Yeah,
I want to back up for a moment and explain what the bonds are, what they do for us. These are generally general obligation bonds. Bonds are passed by the electorate of, in our case, the school district. So it could even go beyond a city's boundaries. It's whatever your school district boundaries are. And they're passed because the state really does not provide funding anymore for facilities improvements. Yeah. You do get some developer fees when you've got new things going on, but if you're in a community like ours, which is pretty much built out, you're not going to get developer fees to help support the schools. Yeah. And those developer fees tend to have to go to that area where the developer is building. So the general obligation bonds are doing things, in our case, in CME, providing security enhancements and improvements. They are upgrading our technology. They are absolutely hitting on our buildings. Most of our buildings were built in the 60s. Just like a home, they have to be maintained. Our maintenance department is good about doing the basic maintenance, but if we've got a major thing that has to happen on that building, we're not going to have the funding for it, and we don't want to take it away from the classroom. So that's why these bonds are so important. But they get paid back in general through your property tax bills. So it's the property owners, both businesses and residential, that are obligated to pay them back. So we have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that they understand what that money goes to, how it's getting paid back, what it costs them. And that's why it becomes a campaign in order to get one on a ballot and then to pass it. And that's where the communications comes in.
That's awesome. Well, can either one of you kind of walk me through a little bit what your strategy is when you sit down, you start that research process, maybe that RPI process, right? That research component of strategically communicating out about an upcoming bond campaign.
Well, one thing I'll say before even getting into that is some people, you talked about it, so you have a need for going out for a bond. You have the money you want to bring in to help improve facilities. And then some people will start the campaign. You really want to start, and this is why our positions are so important in school districts, years in advance. Yeah. If you think you're going to put something on the November ballot, and in May you're going to start this campaign that's going to penetrate your community, and a lot of them, as Jake, we were talking about this earlier today, are not in your school district, they're not in your parents, they're not getting your communications, they're voting for that bond or not, but they're in your community. So that's why our role as public information officers, and it's been great to see the growth over the past few years, are so important for that continued marketing, continued communication and transparency over the years. Because if you don't have a position doing that, if you put something on the ballot and you think a 4-month campaign is going to do a lot, it's not going to. So that's the consistency is really, so if you're thinking in 3 years we might have to go out, now's the time to start the campaign. Now's the time to get a communication person in your district telling your stories, the budget, and all that sort of thing. So that, I think that's step one. Don't wait until you have to do that campaign in 6 months, because by then it's tough to pass.
I want to back us up for a moment and make really clear that we have very strict laws
Yes.
that govern us as government employees about what we can do during work hours. So traditionally, our approach has been to share the information on what is currently going on. If we have a current bond, we actually just finished one and we're smack in the middle of another one right now. And my job from communications is to show what we've been using the money for so far.
Yes.
I cannot go during work hours and campaign on behalf of a new bond, but I can certainly tell them where we're at with this one, which would lead into the information about why we need a new one. So there is a definite line that you cannot cross. Now, in your off hours, just like with any freedom of speech rights, you can campaign, but it's really not a good look to be somebody up in management at a district and advocating for the new bond once we decide to go for it. That process up to then, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the first steps is, as Ryan said, you don't want to just jump into it. It's expensive to put a bond on the ballot. We have to pay for that process through your county clerk's office. So you don't want to do that unless you know you've got enough support for it. And it's not just the support for the idea of the bond. It just like a mortgage on a house, for instance, you have all these variables with interest rates and how long you pay it back. And the community in general might be willing to stomach $30 per $100,000 on their tax bill. They may not be able to stomach $70, which means you've got a different bond amount that you're going for. So all of those things, the due diligence has to be done from the start. You have to ask the questions.
That research component.
That's a good point, though, too. And I remember we were at this conference 7-8 years ago in Sacramento when the state superintendent at the time came in and talked, and he was very pleased with the passage rate of the bonds throughout the state. But I think that's misleading, and you made a great point, because it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to put that bond on the ballot. Now, guess what happens? Every district does pre-polling. And if you know you don't have a chance in the world to pass that, guess what? You don't put it on the bond or on the ballot. So only bonds and measures that have a high likelihood, because to your point, it costs so much money, that's what's included in this high passage rate, which is very misleading. So in that term, they view it as a successful kind of financial model. But if you know you're at 40% pre-polling, you don't put it on. You're not wasting your taxpayers $300,000 to do it. So that pass rate that we all hear is very misleading.
A lot of unreported.
Exactly. And that people that never went for it.
Yep, that never went for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, yeah, that's that research component huge, and doing your due diligence in the beginning, in the outset. And just to kind of double down on what you said, Ryan, and it really does take a culture and a brand awareness and getting buy-in. Don't forget your staff, of course. I'm sure one of you will talk about that. But that your staff are huge brand ambassadors for you. Lean into them. They're out there in the community. Because one thing I know, and I've gotten this as an employee, when my district going out for a bond, I'll have a friend call up and just say, "Hey, I see you guys are going out for a bond. What's going on? What should I say? Yes or no?" And so that they're going to reach out to your staff. All of our teachers have neighbors they're going to talk to. And so like you said, to your point, it starts years in the making. Make sure you're telling your stories. Make sure you're communicating with your community in ways that is giving you broader access than just your parents. Parents and staff, of course, are very important. But one thing I hear sometimes when I talk to districts about going for a bond is they talk about the voters, and I never hear staff mentioned. And I don't hear the parents mentioned. I hear just voters, and they are a captive audience right there that you need to be making sure they feel like they're part of your brand. And you have their support even before, like you said, 4 months ahead of an election.
We do talking points for our staff.
That's good.
That I really like how we did our last bond, which we don't get to name these. So the last bond was named Measure X, and the bond before that, I swear to you, was named Measure C4. So
no.
I think somebody at our county office has quite the sense of humor, yeah. So, but we did talking points. We set up our website with information. We can put the ballot information on there. We just can't take a position on it.
Right.
So, we've got the ballot on there. We have an interpretation on there. We have as much information as possible on our website so it's accessible. And then we let our staff know, this is what you can do. This is what you can't do. This is what we'd like you to do. But, you have your First Amendment rights too, and the information can be here, but this is what the bond is going to do for you. And it's important that they have that buy-in because they are your ambassadors.
Yes.
And we don't always think about that, but they're the ones having the conversations in the aisles of Vons about, hey, I heard your district's trying to raise my property taxes
Yeah.
again. What's that about? And you want them to have intelligent answers and have them feel confident in what they're saying.
So true.
And it's tricky. You brought up a good point earlier too, Jake, when we have to be careful what we say and what we don't say. To boil it down very simply, you can educate as a school district, you can't advocate. So there's a fine line. And then when you're on the campaign committee after hours, you can do, kind of whatever you want to on your own personal time. But that is tricky. One thing districts can do, because what we talked about earlier, a lot of the voters are not in your schools. So you don't have their emails, you don't have direct communication. But starting a community email list now, where they can sign up for the community, put it on your Facebook, put it on your website. It should be your button on your Facebook page. Sign up and you start a community email list. We did that years ago. It'll start very slow. Maybe the first year you'll get 100, 120. But now, 7, 8 years later, we're at 2,500
That's great.
email addresses that are not in our community. I mean, not in our system. They're in our community, but not in the system. So they're voters and they're people that want to be informed. They have businesses. Your alumni, when they're graduating, make sure they have that. The seniors, the parents, before they're out of your email system, send them, say, if you'd like to stay in touch with us, and we'll send you emergency notifications and all that sort of stuff, sign up for our community email list. Otherwise, you're out of our system. We can't communicate with you. But having that direct relationship still with your community and your voters will be very valuable. Even so, if you're not even thinking about a bond, start that community email list now, and that will help you if that happens in 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah, and really, honestly, you should be doing that anyway.
For sure.
Beyond going
Yeah.
for a bond or a referendum or anything else, just having your community informed so that they also, understand the mission, the programs, the services, and the significant value that your district is providing the local community is huge. And sometimes it's tricky to reach those. I know that in Oceanside, when we went for a $163 million bond, one of the things that I was really proud of in that campaign was the communications office. We put together a really beautiful 4-page brochure, full color, 8.5 by 11. It was gorgeous. I worked with a local print shop who believed in the district, cut me a really great deal on that. I designed it, in Canva, and then sent it off to the print shop. He printed it, slapped the labels, mailed it, everything. Handled the postage. It was super easy, and that went out 2 weeks before the election, and it just talked about what your tax dollars hard at work. Where are previous bond dollars gone?
Yeah.
What are some of the projects? Highlighted the girls softball stadium that was done with bond dollars, some of the facilities upgrades and updates that strategically went out just a couple of weeks before an election for the upcoming bond. And like I mentioned earlier, we got that one passed. We were all in San Diego, and just one little component of that. And I shared that to ask. Okay, we talked about the research phase a little bit. We talked about the polling, and if you have decided this is appropriate, we're going to ask the community for these dollars. What's next?
I think in every step along the way, when you decide that you're first going to look into this, you have got to be transparent, and you have got to be bringing up this issue over and over again at your board meetings. You have to have workshops. Our process is we're looking at a bond now to continue on the work of Measure X, which was passed in 2016. It did what it needed to do, but we knew when we passed it, it wasn't going to be enough. It was going to be about half the money that we needed. So it was always in our long-term plan to look at another one. Ideally, from our consultant, and we do have a bond consultant, a lot of districts do that. You want to do these bonds during a presidential election because you have more voters coming out. And so there is definitely a push on our part right now to try to get our next bond measure on the November ballot. So to do that, we started in October. We went back to our consultant who did the last one. He issued the surveys to our community about a month ago. He reported out at the last bond meeting. We had a bond workshop in December. We'll have bond on every agenda from now until November because there's a lot to update. He reported out the survey information and talked about how he conducted that survey. It's pretty interesting and pretty logical. When he's surveying, he's not just looking for people who have buy-in to the schools directly through a child or a grandchild. He specifically was seeking out people who don't have kids in our schools because a homeowner and a property owner still has a great vested interest in having
Yes.
good schools, and not just what happens in the classroom, but physically. If your schools look run down, if they're sources of community blight, it takes your property values down,
Yes,
and
it
it makes
does.
your community less attractive. You don't realize it till you see that happening, and then it's like, oh my gosh, why am I 2 blocks away from a school that looks like trash?
Yeah.
So there's the education part of going out. Education is happening all through that process, but to your question, the next step is making it transparent for the community, putting the information out there step by step, hearing the voices, letting them talk. They have every right to say, I don't want to have another $300 a year on my property taxes, and this is why.
Yeah.
And you have to consider that as you're deciding on numbers. And I think it's July that we have to get it on the ballot for November. So there's still a few months to work. We have to decide what the project list is, what the priorities are. That
Well
has
said.
some community input too.
Yeah.
If we think we need a new gym at this high school and the community's like, no, we want a stadium at the other high school, you got to start looking at that.
Yeah.
Is that realistic? Is that necessary?
And taking that information in and actually being willing to take action on the information that you receive back from your community is a huge lesson that you're sharing right now, Jake. And I think that's one thing that I've seen people get tripped up on is they take surveys, they take the information, that we're never maybe really ready to take action on hearing back from the community at large. And that's a huge mistake. And that burns the trust, and that burns the, being open, honest, transparent communication is then eroded a bit. And it's really hard. It's really easy to mess that up. It's really hard to get it back.
Definitely. This is a lot of money we're talking about. Our last bond was $239 million.
That's so much.
Okay.
Wow.
And we've already spent it,
Yeah.
which in today's dollars makes sense, but
Yes.
it's a lot of money.
It's very
It's a loan against
expensive.
the community that we're doing.
Yeah.
So we really have a high fiduciary responsibility to include people and to listen to them and to honor those that are not in agreement with it. You need a simple majority to pass a bond now for schools. That wasn't always the case, but it was changed because the state will not fund us on facility improvements and renovations. And they wanted to make it easier to get bonds passed. So they gave us a tool to do that,
Yeah.
but a lot of the community, won't be happy with that.
Yeah.
And a tricky factor with that too is a few years ago, they also made it harder because now in the ballot language, you have to put the exact amount that each taxpayer will be basically charged, how long, and in years past, it almost didn't even say where the money was coming from. So now it's much more clear. And so just on the initial survey reads, the rates of approval are lower because of the laws have changed. So that is a hurdle. Another thing too is in California, at least for most of us, we have, and this is national too, a staffing shortage and declining enrollment everywhere. So we've been pumping up our schools and letting them know all the positives. That's what most of us do. We're communicating the great stories and how great our school is in. Part of that message is to attract students, families, staff to deal with the declining enrollment and staffing crisis. But you also need to let the community know of the needs that you have, of the leaky roofs and these things, which is kind of counterintuitive. But if your
Yes.
community, if you're not transparent and they don't know, then it's like, what's the need? Why am I voting for this?
It's all
My own
rainbows and
money.
sunshine, yeah.
Right. So that is a challenge. And if you've recently passed a bond, say 10, 15 years ago, you've been communicating, here's what we've done with the money, here's the beautiful buildings. And then 10, 15 years later, when you go for another one, they're driving past all these beautiful schools and saying, you don't need any money. So the approval is lower. So there's challenges with the system that you need. It's a little bit of a balance.
Oh, it's a lot of a balance. Because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about our bond workshop where we presented photos in
Yes.
our presentation about here's where we need work. And so some of these photos were very scary. You're seeing
Yeah,
tiles
rotted
falling
roof
down.
line or
And
whatever. Yeah,
the next
exactly.
day, what happened? I got a phone call from a parent going, "Why is my kid in a classroom with the tiles falling down?" And I had to say, they're actually not in that classroom, but that all you're seeing is the roof. The classroom was not being used. We don't keep kids in unsafe conditions, but these are the conditions that we need to repair, and that's why we're showing them. So yeah, you have to be really careful, because then it can turn very quickly the other direction. I want to also bring up a tool that we're mandated to follow by the state, which is so incredibly important. Every school bond has oversight by the Citizens Bond Oversight Committee, whatever they name that body. These are members of your community. They cannot be employees. They cannot be subs. They're considered employees. They can't be part-time. They can only be members of the community. And then the bylaws for each group prescribes on what their role is. So in ours, we have one who's a senior representative. We have one who's a PTA representative, and on. And this committee meets as often as they decide to, but their main job, their really only job, is to make sure that the expenditures are going to appropriate places. They cannot make decisions on what the projects are. That's what the bond language is for. But they can come back and say, wait a second, that's not part of the bond. You can't do it like that. So I'll give you an exception. I'll give you an example of something that we corrected immediately when the bond committee caught it. It's the only time they caught something with us on the current bond. But we have an empty campus that we've now repurposed for bond work. It's in the middle of our city, so it's very convenient for the bond staff to work there. And the bond staff is paid for by the bond. They're not, they're bond employees. And so we had to fix up one of the buildings to make it an appropriate office. They were kindergarten classrooms in the past. And so we fixed up the bond office using bond money. And they came back and said, we don't like that, because we think that this should have been a district expense, since this is housing office space. And so we want you to change that. And we went, okay, we're fine with that. We'll just switch it to the other account and pay for it out of the general fund. We can afford to do that. And that's what we did. But, they came to us and just said, that this is too itchy for us. So that's what that committee is there for. And even if you're working toward a new bond, employing those members, when you have a good relationship and you know that they're supportive in general and they're doing audits and things like that, you want them to be your voice, that, hey, this is what we do to be appropriate. And then your county offices of education also oversee how that money is being spent. So we're being watched from many directions on this.
And oversight committees have become so much more important because of where we're at politically and financially. One of the things you'll find in your pre-polling, whether your community supports, is one of the questions will be, how much is financial transparency important? And that always ranks so high. So you have to have a comprehensive oversight committee. You have to be transparent about it. If you don't have that plan in place and communicate that we will be very transparent, we have an oversight committee, here's who's on it, it will be much more difficult to pass, because that's what people really are concerned about, especially the ones that are in your community but not in your schools. If they're going to pay for that, they want to know where every dime goes. So that's another really good point. That oversight committee is key to passing it.
Yeah, it is. And it should be noted, like you had mentioned, a consultant. Many districts do work with a consultant. I know that I certainly did in my district when we got our bond passed. Consultant helps really walk you through, guide you through this process. I guess I should say also that we're not attorneys, so legal advice here, right, isn't real. But
we play one on YouTube.
We play one on YouTube, but all three of us have experience going through this process. And all that to say, definitely consult with your legal team as well, because there are certain do's and don'ts, and there are certain things. I know F3, shout out to F3, really phenomenal law firm out here in California, and they even have a one-pager on it that they give districts that just says, here's all the election do's and don'ts, which is great.
CSBA also has information about coming into election season, about how to handle them, and a bond is an election too, so you can take that information and apply it similarly.
It is, and you mentioned something right now, Jake, that I didn't never think about doing it, but even when I wasn't going through a bond, it's probably worth my time to get my hands on like that one pager and give it out to staff during any election season, so that they know what some of the things they can do and some of the things they can't do are.
That's a whole nother conversation
The tricky part, once you get the campaign committee going and established, it's mostly community volunteers. And you talked about you bring in companies to help you with this who have experience in it. And it's difficult to navigate because everyone will have ideas of what we should do. And as much as you think you have a great idea, somebody on your committee has a great idea, you need to prepare them for it's probably not a good idea. Because it is way more science polling and passing bond measures than art. So while you think you have this great, oh, we're going to use social media, we're going to send out this flyer, they have it dialed in through years and years of doing this. They do all the polling through all these communities. So still bring your ideas, bring it to the table, but just know, and there's a return on investment. You can't do every idea. You have to do the most effective communicating that's going to get the most results. So while your idea may be fantastic, it only may get you 6 votes. You need to spend time on what's going to get you 600 votes. So everyone has ideas, they're excited to do it, but you really need to rely on the experts and kind of take a back seat to the strategy and let them do it, because they do it. You hire a good firm and kind of, you're there to help and guide, but you'll have PTA people and everyone will be on the committee and they'll all have ideas. And the people that run this that we hire, they do a great job of entertaining them all, but they have a system that is pretty solid, and it's science, not art. So that's one of the things you have to navigate, though, as you sit on these committees is, okay, bring your ideas, but just know they're guiding us, they've done it, and what's tried and true, that just works.
I'll give you an example of something that happened during the polling with our consultant last month, which to me is the reason why it's so helpful to have somebody who knows what they're doing with this survey work, how to do it. When for our community and the size of our voterate, 400 was the magic number for a sampling, a statistical sampling. So out of that 400, like I said, about 1/3, he actively sought people who do not have people in our schools. Yeah. So going out to the 400, he did phone surveys, and we have a slightly older community, even though our schools are obviously young. He started off with the basic question, would you support a bond measure? And then it got divided out by political party, it got divided out by age demographics, racial, all those aspects. But the hard number at the end of it was 54.7% said that they would pass it. 55% is our magic number, our threshold for pursuing a bond. So he started with this one question, and then from there, every question after that provided information as well as asking the question. So it was, did you know that we have, 8 facilities that were built in the early 1960s, and we're starting to see some of the structural issues? The question is, would you be supportive of improving those facilities? Yeah. Okay, so that's how they're working the questions. Yep. By the time they got to the final question was an exact repeat of the first question. Would you support a school facilities bond? So the number of support went from 54.7% to 57%. That was in a 10-minute conversation because the education happened along the way. And that's why you work with people who know what they're doing.
That's brilliant.
Because then they can sit down and say, okay, now we know where the education needs to happen. Each question's broken down with their responses. Where are we struggling with stuff? Where are they for it? Yeah. And it also helps guide what the bond is for. So we knew in the last bond that security was the main issue. Okay. We needed to close campuses. We did not want to do metal detectors, but we needed cameras. We needed radio systems. We needed all sorts of things. And that's what the bond went to. Because in part, we knew that's what the people would support.
And you know what's interesting about this, and you mentioned it's more science than art, which I totally agree with. And then there's things like this, like the way you word a survey. Right? There's when you're working with a professional like that, don't hesitate also to pay attention to those subtle nuances that you can glean and use yourself in future campaigns, totally unrelated to bonds or elections. I mean, just the way the language was worded in that survey reference you just gave. I mean, we all send out surveys in our district, and what a beautiful way to frame the questions so that you're providing information in a way that you know you're getting better data back. You're not just throwing questions out. Let me give you a little bit, here's the why, and here's the question. Really great tip. Go back and use that on any survey that you send out. Should not be done without that.
And I love the surveys too, because it's kind of a nerdy thing, but you dive into the numbers, and Jake was talking about the demographics, the race, the what political party you're in, and the age demographics, and it is fascinating. And then they do the results before education, after education, and then they'll do one too, which is a little more depressing, is after an opposition, like here's the opposition's potential argument, which is kind of a generic, too much taxes, blah, 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 administrators are wasting money, and then you'll see the result shift too. So that's why the communication is so important. So you may just have to educate, you may have to educate at another level because you have inaccurate opposition to it. So it becomes tricky, but I've been on a part of a couple of these, and it is fascinating, just the science of human behavior and the kind of knowing the community. But there are little subtleties in different communities that aren't just general, and that's where you come in and help explain the community and wants and needs. To your other point, you mentioned gym earlier, gyms. We have that same thing where we think gyms will resonate. We're like, we put gyms on there, and they're like, nobody cares about your gyms. You're like, what do you mean? All we hear about is gyms. And they're like, you hear that from parents, not from voters. So there's two different kind of segments. So it's like, while we all think a gym is going to pass this
Or a new
thing
theater.
easily, yes, they say those people aren't in your schools. They care about transparency of the oversight committee. They care about
parking lots.
They care
because
about
it gets
Yes,
the cars off of the
traffic. Yes,
streets
traffic.
Yes.
that block their driveway.
so
you know?
even to that,
You have to think like that.
Yeah.
to being open to that's not a good idea. I put a lot of those ideas out there, and they're like, yeah, that's not so great. But we come from a different lens, so
Yeah,
it's
that's
interesting to go through the process and hear what they say.
And speaking of process and this whole thing, some of this might sound kind of scary, and especially if we got somebody watching this video and they've never gone through it, and they know that it's coming up, and their superintendent's going to tap them on the shoulder. Talk to me about your level of apprehension when you know you're going to go into an election season and you know your district's going to go out for a bond or referendum. How do you feel about that personally? Is it a scary animal? And when you get to the end of it, are you like okay that you went through it? Like, do you come out just haggard and torn apart, or are you okay? You're going to survive and it'll be all right.
Fun.
There you go.
If you pass it, it's one of the greatest things ever.
It is.
It's a different way to interact with the community, and maybe I'm a comm geek to the core, but that's what I'm doing this for. I want to. My personal job is to be interacting successfully with the community and to make those connections. I want to see the bond pass. At the time that we did the last one, my daughter was a student in our schools. So it was directly impacting me.
Yeah.
But more than that, I see how it improves our system as a whole. I see the jobs that come from it. And we're always talking about, jobs, and bonds create jobs right there. I want our community to be involved in that. I want them to know what we're doing with their money. I want them to be proud of what we're doing. But I also like that process of reaching out. I like talking to people, even if they don't want it. Having that debate, having that open intercourse, I think is really important for us.
That challenge. And what about you, Ryan?
It can be challenging because there is a lot of work and it can seem overwhelming, but it is exciting. I'm kind of a data geek too, so I like the polling, I like the research. Who do we have to go to? But my first advice would be start now, way before you think you're going to go for a bond. Hire somebody in-house to do communications. If not in-house, hire a consultant to do some messaging. If you had a parcel tax or bond measure you did 10 years ago, update the community on what you use that money for, and start early with communication and transparency with your community. That will help big time. And then bring in professionals as soon as you can too. You're going to have all these ideas, how you think you can pass a bond, and then you're going to soon realize there's experts that have a lot of good ideas that you're going to want to utilize as well. And then you'll go through the process and it'll be what it will be. But there is a system. It can be overwhelming. It's a lot of work, but it is rewarding because you're doing, and a lot of the messaging, we'll have ideas of social media and digital. It's still old school. It's still phone banking. It's still door knocking. So you'll have these ideas, and they've implemented some and text messaging, but it is fun because you get to know people in your community. Your PTA is volunteering. You're working late nights, and so it's tough work, but it's very rewarding because if you pass a $300 million bond for your community, that sets up your schools for another 20 years, and that's what we're all in it for, to help kids, to help families in our community. So it's hard work, but it's super rewarding.
But I'm going to say, do learn the rules. Learn what you can do, learn what you can't do, and learn when you can do those things, because you don't want to get in trouble. A couple of years ago at a CalSPRA conference, I had somebody come up to me and ask for advice because their superintendent had them working on a bond campaign during work hours and expected them to do it. And I just very diplomatically said, you need to learn your rules, because what they're asking from how you're telling it to me is not not kosher, and you don't want to get in trouble and have that bond sink, and you don't want to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, when I asked that, I knew exactly how both of you would answer, and I felt the same. I think it's a challenge, and it's a unique communications challenge. that only comes around once in a while.
Yeah.
So if you're, I would say, if you're lucky enough to get to work through an election
That is
like
a
that,
very positive way to put that.
right? Then what you want to do is really lean into your connections, lean into your partners, lean into your friends like you had just referenced that have gone through it before, your networks, your professional networks, your legal team, consultant if you're working on one, and really try to learn from some of the strategies that you're going to be going through, because it will stretch you in some new ways, which is it can be a really, really good thing.
I would suggest two things too. Attend your Citizen Bond Oversight Committee meetings. Okay, I attend
didn't
every
do that.
single one.
Yeah.
Even though I'm not in the bond department, I'm the communications person for the district. So I have some of the historical knowledge that often comes up. Why are we doing this? To give clarity. But more than that, just so that you know the people and you know their direction and they've got clear information. So that's one. And the other thing is, as a communications person, if you have never taken a class, just a basic class in statistics, double back and do that. I don't care if it's online, because when you understand how the surveys are done, when you understand what your means are and your sampling sizes, when I have the community, which they did come to us last week and say, you only asked 400 people and I wasn't one of those 400 people, so I don't understand how you can use that. I could turn around and intelligently explain how there's a formula that based on your population of voters, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
That's smart.
And I could answer that instead of going, well, I don't know, it sounds like a low number to me when it's
Solid
not.
goal.
So if I had any single class in journalism school that carried over to communications now that was helpful, most helpful, it was statistics. And I was not a math geek. I
Solid
barely got a B
goal
at that
right
class.
there. Solid goal, because you could very well be confronted at any moment, public board meeting, whatever. So
And you're not alone in this. Most people have done a bond in the past 10 years, so they have advice. And the other thing you can ask is, what company should I go with that's the best to work with, that's going to work with our PTAs, our community as well, and who has a high success rate. So all that information is out there. So it's just reaching out. And all of us in California have done it, and other states are doing it. So there's a lot of information and resources to get. You just got to go get
true.
it. Yeah.
Well, I know that we're running up on time here, and I know we've got a really busy conference to get back to. Awards night tonight, the gala. It's going to be a beautiful evening here in Sacramento at CalSPRA. So I want to let you go, but before I do, I just wanted to ask one last question, and that is, anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to share, or any last tips and tricks?
We have not talked about my Peach Jar pin that I'm representing, and my Peach Jar socks that I'll be representing tonight at the gala.
You're not on
big
right
time.
now.
No,
But yeah, this
Shameless
this
I want
self-promotion
that.
going on
I want
there.
that noted. I'm a big fan of the peach.
beautiful peach jar lapel pin. you got
I
on the
wasn't
collar.
lucky enough to get one of those, so we'll just let Ryan
I
carry
think
it
you
for
just
me.
earned one. I mean, right?
Yeah, we'll get
Who
you
do
one.
we-
We'll
I
get you
mean,
one.
What's the Peach Jar team doing?
I don't know.
Falling down on that.
We'll get on that. All right. Well, I really appreciate both of your time. This is awesome. I know you're actually running to another session right now that you're co-presenting on.
Yep.
So we got to get you out of here.
Good.
Be sure to like, share,
Thank
comment,
you, though.
follow for more. I can't thank both of you enough for joining me on this. Ryan, thank you for co-hosting
Fun,
this. with
yeah,
me.
it's
This is
great.
awesome.
Yeah,
Really
great
appreciate
conversation.
it. And Jake, thanks for sitting with us and talking through it. This is great. If you have any questions, I know all three of us would take those. So feel free to reach out,
Absolutely.
get in the comments, reach out directly. Like Jake already said, somebody already reached out to her in the past about kind of just advice on this. So we'd be happy to take those
She's
calls.
great. She'll get back to you. She's very knowledgeable.
She
And
is.
you
Hit her
have
up.
too over the years.
All right, that's it. We'll see you later.
Thank you.
Be sure to follow the School PR Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and X, where you can find additional resources and highlights from the show. Please like, subscribe, and all the fun stuff. And most importantly, without our sponsors, this podcast doesn't exist. Please visit schoolstatus.com, peachjar.com, nickelstrategies.com, and smore.com. Until next time, keep learning, inspiring, and making a difference. Thanks so much for your support of the School PR Podcast.